Hi, so we're going to start on Unit 3, Part 1 on triangles, and Part 2 will be on parallelograms. So we begin with just how to classify a triangle. And we classify triangles by two components. One is by sides, and the other one is by angles. So under the section where it says by sides, we're going to begin there. Okay, so with that, when we're looking at a triangle and all the sides are not congruent, we call that type of triangle a scalene triangle. So scalene is spelled S-C-A-L-E-N-E. Now, if we look at the sides and we notice that these sides are marked congruent with that single tick mark, at least two sides being congruent, then we label this as an isosceles triangle. And lastly, if all three sides are equal, we have an equilateral triangle. So the word equal, which is part of an equation, or equal sign EQU, is in front of lateral, which is sides. So equilateral means that all three sides are congruent. Something interesting to note is that if a triangle is an equilateral triangle, it can also be classified as isosceles. However, in most cases, we would describe it as an equilateral triangle, but there might be, a trick question here or there where it asks, is an equilateral triangle also an isosceles triangle? Which it is, because by definition, an isosceles triangle has to have at least two sides. So now down to classification by angles, which I'll highlight in blue. This classification has 3 here, as well as a fourth description, which is up on top. It didn't fit, so I just squeezed it up on top. So if all the angles are acute angles, and keep in mind that the angles, and we'll talk about this in the next lesson, of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. If all three angles happen to be acute angles, less than, and remember acute means less than 90 degrees, then we would describe this as an acute triangle by angles. If, however, one of the angles happens to be obtuse, and again, that's greater than 90 degrees, then we would describe this as an obtuse triangle. And lastly, if one of the angles within the triangles happens to be a right angle, 90 degrees, marked off by this little square in a corner, then we would describe it as a right triangle. Now, putting it all together, we usually will describe it by sides, then by angles. There's also a fourth classification of angles called equiangular, and that's very similar to equilateral, except for the fact that it describes a triangle with 3 congruent angles. So again, equiangular, you have the word angle in it, and the equilateral, lateral refers to sides. And down below here, you're going to have a few problems tonight where you have to classify by angles and by sides. I usually describe the triangle by sides first, and then by angles. So by one, I mean first, second. If, however, you describe by angles first and then sides second, that is fine as well. I think that is just a recommendation, but it's not required. Okay, so classify each triangle by angles and sides. So I would describe it as 2 words. Okay, so make sure you have 2 words when they say this. So the first part is going to be by, we'll keep the highlighting color. The yellow indicates by sides. So let's highlight this in yellow, and I'll do the same thing on the other side so that we just kind of keep it all organized. This is by angles, which we see here is blue, and I'll underline here. All right, so the first triangle we see is by sides. We have at least 2 sides being congruent, 5 and 5. So this is isosceles. And then by angle, because one of the angles is a right angle, then we would say this is an isosceles right triangle. Over on the right, for the second example, we see that by sides, all 3 sides are not congruent. So we would describe this as scalene. And then lastly, the angle, one of the angles, is greater than 90 degrees.